The Real Dracula, Vlad the Impaler. So you think you know Dracula. Suave vampire turns into a bat, afraid of garlic, sparkles in sunlight. If we're talking about that version. But here's the thing, the real Dracula was actually worse than the fictional one. Way worse. Because Vlad III of Wallachia didn't need supernatural powers to be absolutely terrifying. He had impalement. And when I say impalement, I don't mean the quick, merciful kind you're imagining. I mean a carefully engineered torture method designed to keep victims alive and suffering for hours, sometimes days, while displayed as a forest of human agony to terrify anyone who dared oppose him. We're talking about a guy who allegedly ate dinner surrounded by impaled corpses, who sent his Sultan an entire shipment of Turkish body parts, and who became so notorious for his cruelty that his name literally means son of the dragon or son of the devil, depending on how you translate it. The fictional Dracula is a monster. The real Dracula was a medieval warlord who made that fiction look tame. Tonight we're diving into the actual story of Vlad the Impaler, how a hostage prince became one of history's most brutal rulers, why his own people both feared and revered him, and how a 15th century Romanian warlord's reputation for extreme violence ended up inspiring the most famous vampire in literature. Light your candles, get comfortable, and let's meet the real Dracula. Vlad III was born in 1431 in Transylvania, which, yeah, is actually a real place in Romania, not just a spooky movie setting. His father was Vlad II Dracul, which means Vlad the Dragon. Dracul got that name because he was inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a secret society of knights dedicated to defending Christianity against the Ottoman Empire. Very medieval, very prestigious, very we wear cool cloaks and have secret meetings. But here's where it gets interesting. Dracul in Romanian can mean both dragon and devil. So when Vlad III took the name Dracula, meaning son of Dracul, he was either calling himself son of the dragon or son of the devil. Both interpretations stuck. His enemies definitely went with devil version. Vlad's birthplace was Sighisoara, a fortified medieval town in Transylvania that still exists today and is absolutely gorgeous if you're into Gothic architecture and cobblestone streets. The house where he was supposedly born is now a restaurant, which is the most capitalist thing ever. Come eat schnitzel where a mass murderer was born. But I digress. His early childhood was actually relatively stable, which makes what came later even more striking. He had three brothers, Mircea, Vlad, and Radu. His father ruled Wallachia on and off, constantly fighting for power against rival claimants and trying to navigate the impossible political situation of being stuck between two empires. Wallachia itself was a relatively new principality, only established in the early 1300s when the region broke away from Hungarian control. By the time Vlad was born, it had become this brutal game of musical chairs, where rulers were constantly being assassinated, overthrown, or driven out by rival factions. The average reign of a Wallachian prince was about 2 years before they got murdered. It was not a job with a good life expectancy. Vlad grew up watching this nightmare of medieval geopolitics play out. Wallachia was stuck between the Kingdom of Hungary to the west and the Ottoman Empire to the east. Imagine trying to run a small country sandwiched between two superpowers who both want to control you both want you to fight for them, and both will absolutely destroy you if you pick the wrong side. That was Wallachia in the 1400s. His father played a dangerous game, switching allegiances, making deals, trying to keep Wallachia independent while not getting crushed by either empire. It was the medieval equivalent of trying to stay neutral in a bar fight. Eventually, someone's going to punch you anyway. The situation got worse when the Ottoman Empire started aggressively expanding into Eastern Europe. Sultan Murad II wanted all the Balkan territories under his control, and Wallachia was a key strategic position. It controlled important trade routes and mountain passes. Whoever controlled Wallachia controlled access between the Balkans and Central Europe. Vlad II tried to play both sides. He'd make alliances with Hungary, then switch to the Ottomans when Hungary got weak, then switch back. It was exhausting and dangerous, and it taught young Vlad an important lesson. Loyalty was a weakness, and everyone would betray you eventually. And then in 1442, when Vlad was only 11 years old, his father made a deal that would shape everything that came after. To prove his loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan, Vlad II handed over his two youngest sons as hostages, Vlad III and his younger brother Radu. They were sent to the Ottoman Empire basically as insurance. If their father betrayed the Ottomans, his sons would die. So picture this, you're 11 years old, you're a prince, and suddenly you're ripped from your home and sent to live with your father's enemies, knowing that your life is literally a bargaining chip. If your dad makes one wrong political move, you're dead. That's the kind of childhood that creates either broken people or absolutely ruthless ones. Vlad and Radu were taken to Edirne, then the Ottoman capital before Constantinople was conquered in 1453. They weren't thrown in a dungeon. The Ottomans were more sophisticated than that. Instead, they were placed in a palace complex called Edrigoz, where noble hostages from various conquered or vassal states were kept. This wasn't a prison in the traditional sense, it was more like a combination military academy and political re-education camp. The Ottoman Empire had a long tradition of taking hostages from vassal states and turning them into loyal Ottoman servants. Sometimes they'd be sent back to rule their home countries as Ottoman puppets. Sometimes they'd be absorbed into the Ottoman military or administrative system. Either way, the goal was to make them more Ottoman than whatever they'd been before. The boys were educated in the Islamic faith, Turkish language and literature, logic, mathematics, and the Quran. They were trained in horseback riding, archery, sword fighting, and military tactics. They learned Ottoman court etiquette and how to navigate the Byzantine politics of the Sultan's court. It was a comprehensive education designed to create capable administrators and military commanders. For some hostages, the system worked beautifully. They arrive as foreign princes and leave as devoted servants of the Sultan, having been shown that the Ottoman Empire offered power, stability, and opportunity that their home countries couldn't match. But the experience was radically different for the two brothers, and understanding that split is crucial to understanding what Vlad became. Radu, the younger brother, apparently adapted pretty well. He was charming, diplomatic, and good at reading social situations. He learned Turkish fluently, embraced Ottoman culture, and made friends at court. He was reportedly handsome, well-liked, and politically savvy. The Ottomans called him Radu Selfrumos, Radu the Handsome. He also became close with Mehmed, the Sultan's son, who was around the same age. How close is a matter of historical debate. Some sources suggest they were just friends. Others hint at a romantic relationship. Ottoman culture at the time was more fluid about same-sex relationships than medieval Christian Europe, so it's possible. Either way, Radu clearly saw opportunity in the Ottoman system and decided to work within it. He eventually converted to Islam and became a trusted Ottoman commander. Vlad Vlad did not adapt well. He was reportedly stubborn, defiant, and hostile to his captors. He refused to fully embrace Ottoman culture or convert to Islam. He got into fights with other hostages. He was frequently punished, beaten, whipped, thrown into isolation. The Ottomans tried the carrot and stick approach, offering him privileges if he cooperated and punishing him when he didn't. Neither worked. But here's the thing, Vlad was learning. He just wasn't learning what the Ottomans wanted him to learn. He watched other hostages get executed when their families betrayed the Sultan. He saw how Ottoman politics worked, how the court functioned, how power was maintained through a combination of reward and terror. He learned that mercy was seen as weakness, that showing emotion made you vulnerable, and that the only thing that mattered in this world was power. He also learned about impalement because the Ottoman used it as a form of execution. They didn't invent it. Impalement was an ancient punishment used by various cultures, going back to the Assyrians. But the Ottomans used it for serious crimes like rebellion or treason. It was meant to be a public spectacle, a warning to others about what happened when you crossed the Sultan. Vlad was paying attention to all of this. He was learning how to rule through fear, how to use public displays of violence for political ends, and how to project an image of absolute ruthlessness that would make people too terrified to oppose you. He was also developing a deep, burning hatred for the Ottomans, not just because they were his captors, but because they represented everything he saw as threatening his homeland. They were foreign, they were powerful, and they were winning. They'd conquered Constantinople in 1453, giving them control of the strategic straits between Europe and Asia. They were pushing deeper into the Balkans every year, and they turned his own brother into one of their loyal servants. Meanwhile, back in Wallachia, things were going badly for Vlad's family. His father and oldest brother Mircea were overthrown in 1447 by John Hunyadi, a powerful Hungarian military commander who wanted a more pro-Hungarian ruler in Wallachia. Vlad II was killed. Sources vary on whether he was assassinated or died in battle. Mircea was captured, tortured, and buried alive. So now Vlad's father was dead, his oldest brother was dead, his other older brother had died earlier under mysterious circumstances, and Radu had gone full Ottoman. Vlad was the last surviving son who hadn't converted or died. He was 16 years old, still a hostage, and everything he'd known was destroyed. The Ottomans released him in 1448, gave him an army, and sent him to take a Wallachian throne as their vassal. It was a test. Let's see if this hostile, angry teenager can actually rule. If he succeeds, we have a puppet prince. If he fails, no loss. Vlad marched into Wallachia, claimed the throne, and ruled for exactly 2 months before he was overthrown by forces loyal to John Hunyadi. He fled to Moldavia, another Romanian principality, and spent the next several years in exile, watching other people sit on his throne while he had nothing. This is important context because when Vlad finally did gain power permanently in 1456, he wasn't some naive idealist who then became corrupted. He'd already spent years as a hostage watching people get tortured and executed. He'd already seen his family destroyed by political betrayals. He'd already been given power and had it ripped away. By the time he took the throne for his second reign, he was already radicalized, already ruthless, and already convinced that extreme violence was the only way to maintain power and protect Wallachia from being conquered. In 1456, Vlad got his chance. John Hunyadi, the Hungarian military commander who'd killed his father and brother, had died of plague. The current Wallachian ruler, Vladislav II, was weak and unpopular, and Vlad had Hungarian backing from a new political faction that thought he'd be useful. Vlad marched in with an army, killed Vladislav II in a single combat, according to some accounts, and took the throne. He was 25 years old and absolutely done with everyone's shit. His first priority was making sure nobody could overthrow him the way that they'd overthrown every other Wallachian ruler for the past century. And his method for ensuring this was simple: eliminate anyone who might pose a threat and make the elimination so horrifying that nobody else would dare try. The boyars were the main problem. There were the noble families who owned most of the land, controlled most of the wealth, and had been playing kingmaker for decades. They'd assassinate a prince they didn't like, put a new one on the throne, and then assassinate him too when he stopped being useful. They'd betrayed Vlad's father, they'd helped kill his brother, and they were definitely planning to betray Vlad too if it suited their interests. So on Easter Sunday, 1459, Vlad invited all the leading boyar families to a feast at his palace in Targoviste. It was a holiday, it was a celebration, it was a chance for the new prince to show goodwill to the nobility. Everyone came dressed in their finest clothes, ready to eat and drink and play politics. After the feast, Vlad had soldiers surround the hall. He asked the assembled boyars a question: "How many princes have you known in your lifetimes?" The older boyars started counting. Some had served under 7 different princes. Some had served under more. They were proud of their longevity and political survival skills. "See, we've outlasted all these rulers. We are the real power here." Vlad took this as a confession. These men had not just witnessed the assassination of princes, they'd participated in them. They'd conspired, betrayed, and murdered their way through decades of political chaos, treating the throne as a revolving door. He had the older boyars arrested and impaled immediately. Not quickly, not mercifully, the full horrific version where death would take hours or days. Their bodies were raised on stakes outside the palace where everyone could see them. The younger boyars and their families, the ones who hadn't personally participated in as many betrayals, but who represented the next generation of potential conspirators, he treated differently. He didn't kill them. Instead, he forced them to march. Vlad's castle at Poenari, high in the Carpathian Mountains, had fallen into ruin. It needed to be rebuilt, so Vlad had these young nobles, still dressed in their Easter finest, march about 50 miles north to the ruined fortress. Then he put them to work. They had to rebuild the entire castle from scratch. No breaks, no mercy, minimal food and water. They worked until their fancy clothes fell off in rags. They worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. Most of them died during the construction. The ones who survived became the garrison for Vlad's new fortress, completely broken and dependent on him for survival. It was brutal, it was efficient, and it sent a very clear message. The old power structure was over. The boyars were no longer the real power in Wallachia. Vlad was, and anyone who forgot that would end up on a stake. But Vlad didn't stop with the boyars. He went after crime with the same absolute zero tolerance approach. Theft, impalement. Lying, impalement. Adultery, impalement. Being poor and unable to contribute to society, believe it or not, also impalement. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal, but widely repeated in contemporary sources, about Vlad's approach to law and order. He placed a golden cup at a public fountain in Targoviste. Anyone could use it to drink from the fountain, but they had to leave it there. The cup was solid gold, valuable enough to change a peasant's life forever if they stole it. Allegedly, the cup was never stolen during Vlad's entire reign, not because people had suddenly become moral, but because everyone knew what happened to thieves. They'd seen the stakes along the roads, they'd smelt the rotting corpses, they knew that no amount of gold was worth being tortured to death over days while displayed as a public spectacle. Crime in Wallachia dropped to almost nothing. Travelers could move safely through the region. Merchants felt secure leaving their goods unguarded. By medieval standards, Vlad's Wallachia became one of the safest places in Europe. Of course, the safety came at the cost of living under a tyrant who might have you impaled for basically any reason. It's easy to reduce crime when the punishment for everything is torture and death. Vlad also had strong opinions about beggars and the disabled. In one of the most disturbing acts, he allegedly invited all the sick, poor, and disabled people in Wallachia to a feast at one of his palaces. Hundreds showed up, grateful for the free food, at the prince's apparent generosity. After they'd eaten, Vlad asked them, "Would you like to be without cares, so that you need for nothing in this world?" Of course they said yes. They thought he was offering them permanent support or housing. Instead, he had the building locked and set on fire, burning everyone inside alive. His justification, according to the sources, was that they were a burden on the state, and now they truly had no more cares or needs. Whether the story is literally true is debated by historians, but even if it's exaggerated or fabricated, the fact that it was told about Vlad and widely believed tells you something about his reputation. These weren't stories people told about kind rulers. These were horror stories about a man who saw human life as something to be managed and eliminated if inconvenient. Let's talk about impalement in detail, because this is what Vlad became famous for, and understanding the method explains a lot about his psychological approach to rule. Impalement as an execution method was ancient. The Assyrians used it, the Persians used it. It appears in various cultures across history as a punishment for serious crimes, but most cultures used it sparingly for worst offenders, and they usually did it in a way that killed relatively quickly. Vlad refined it into an art form. The version Vlad perfected was designed for maximum suffering and maximum visual impact. Death could take anywhere from a few hours to 3 days, depending on the angle of the stake, the victim's body weight, and how carefully the execution was carried out. Some victims would die relatively quickly from shock or blood loss. Others would linger for days, conscious and in agony. The bodies would be left displayed. This was crucial to Vlad's strategy. Impalement wasn't just execution, it was communication. Stakes would line roads, surround cities, fill public squares. They were arranged in geometric patterns, in circles, in rows. The display was deliberately organized and maintained. And Vlad used this method constantly, not just for serious crimes, not just for enemies and war, but for everything. The estimate for how many people Vlad impaled during his reign vary wildly. Some sources say 40,000, some say 100,000, some go even higher. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but even if we take the most conservative estimates, we're still talking about tens of thousands of people tortured to death in one of the most brutal ways possible. To put that in perspective, the entire population of Wallachia at the time was maybe 500,000 people. If Vlad impaled even 40,000 people during his 6 years' reign, that's nearly 10% of the total population. Proportionally, that would be like a modern leader of a mid sized country executing millions of people. Contemporary sources describe Vlad's preferences for impalement in disturbing detail. He allegedly liked to arrange the stakes in geometric patterns and vary the heights based on the victim's social rank. High-ranking victims would be placed on taller stakes, lower-ranking victims on shorter ones. This created a visual hierarchy even in death. There are accounts of Vlad having stakes of different thicknesses prepared for men, women, and children, of him having special stakes made for specific individuals, of him personally supervising executions to ensure that was done properly. The German pamphlets printed after his death describe a scene where Vlad was eating breakfast surrounded by impaled victims. One victim, still alive and suffering on his stake, said, "O Lord, you want to eat bread dipped in blood." This apparently annoyed Vlad, who had that man impaled on an extra tall stake so he'd be closer to heaven and away from stench of the other corpses. Another story describes Turkish envoys who came to meet with Vlad. When they entered his presence, they kept their turbans on, which was their custom, but which Vlad interpreted as disrespect. He asked why they didn't remove their turbans. They explained it was against their tradition. So Vlad said, "Well then, I shall strengthen your tradition," and had the turbans nailed to their heads with 3 iron spikes. Are these stories literally true? Some probably are, some are probably exaggerated, and some might be completely fabricated. But the sheer volume of similar accounts from different sources suggests that the core pattern was real. Vlad used impalement systematically, frequently, and publicly as his primary tool of governance. But here's where it gets complicated, because while Vlad was absolutely a sadistic tyrant to his own people, he was also fighting for his country's survival against an empire that was actively trying to conquer all of Eastern Europe. The Ottoman Empire in the 1450s and the 1460s was at the height of its power. Sultan Mehmed II, yes, the same Mehmed who had been friends with Vlad's brother Radu during their hostage years, had conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire and giving the Ottomans control of the strategic Bosphorus Strait. He'd conquered Serbia, Bosnia, and large parts of Greece and Albania. He was pushing north and west, planning to eventually take Vienna and expand into Central Europe. Wallachia was directly in the path of this expansion. It controlled crucial mountain passes for the Carpathians and important trade routes. If the Ottoman controlled Wallachia, they'd have a direct path into Hungary and the rest of Eastern Europe. Vlad's father had tried to play both sides and ended up dead. His brother Radu had switched sides entirely and became an Ottoman commander. Vlad decided on a different approach: total war. Starting in 1459, Vlad began preparing for an inevitable Ottoman invasion. He fortified his mountain strongholds, built up his army, and started raiding Ottoman territories south of the Danube River. These weren't just military raids, they were terror campaigns designed to inflict maximum damage and send a message to the Sultan. In the winter of 1461-62, Vlad launched a major raid across the Danube. His forces swept through Ottoman-controlled Bulgaria, hitting towns, villages, and military outposts. They killed soldiers, civilians, anyone they encountered. The exact death toll is unclear, but Vlad's own letter to the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus claimed he'd killed over 23,000 people in this campaign. The letter includes a detailed breakdown: 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians have been killed by us, not counting those whom we burned in homes of the Turks, whose heads were cut by our soldiers. Vlad sent this letter with a cart full of body parts as proof: ears, noses, heads, preserved in barrels of honey. He wanted Hungarian support for this war, and he was proving that he was serious about fighting the Ottomans. Whether the numbers are accurate is debatable. Medieval body counts were notoriously exaggerated, but the fact that Vlad sent actual physical evidence suggests he killed at least several thousand people in a relatively short campaign, and the brutality was clearly deliberate. This wasn't just military action, it was terrorism meant to provoke the Sultan into open war. It worked. Sultan Mehmed II, who was not a man known for backing down from challenges, decided it was time to deal with this upstart Wallachian prince once and for all. In the spring of 1462, he assembled a massive army. Estimates range from 90,000 to 150,000 men, along with the artillery and support troops. Vlad had maybe 30,000 troops total, probably fewer. He was outnumbered at least 3 to 1, possibly 5 to 1. He was facing one of the most powerful military forces in the world, led by a sultan who had conquered Constantinople and crushed armies across 3 continents. By any reasonable calculation, Wallachia should have been crushed in a matter of weeks. So Vlad did something insane. On the night of June 17, 1462, Vlad launched a surprise attack directly on the Sultan's main camp. This wasn't a defensive strategy, wasn't a guerrilla ambush on the supply line, wasn't a tactical retreat. This was a full cavalry assault aimed at killing the Sultan himself in his own camp, surrounded by tens of thousands of his soldiers. It was either brilliant or suicidal, and honestly, probably both. Vlad had been using scorched earth tactics as the Ottomans advanced north. His forces would retreat before the main Ottoman army, burning crops, poisoning wells, and destroying anything that could support an army. The Ottomans were advancing through a wasteland, struggling to find food and clean water, dealing with supply problems. But Vlad knew the strategy couldn't work forever. Eventually, the Ottomans would reach Wallachia's cities and population centers. Eventually, they'd besiege his fortresses, and eventually, sheer numbers would win. So he decided to decapitate the entire invasion by killing Mehmed. Vlad's intelligence network had identified where the Sultan's main camp was located. His forces had captured Ottoman troops and learned the passwords and camp layout. They'd taken Ottoman uniforms from dead soldiers. On the night of June 17, under cover of darkness, Vlad led a cavalry force of about 10,000, 15,000 men in a direct assault on the Ottoman camp. They wore Ottoman uniforms, they knew the passwords, they moved through the camp in the darkness, systematically setting fires, killing sentries, and creating absolute chaos. The Ottoman army, which had been confident and relaxed after days of unopposed marching, suddenly found itself under attack from within. Tents were burning, soldiers were being cut down by what appeared to be other Ottoman soldiers. Nobody knew who was attacking or how many attackers were there. Vlad's forces fought their way deep into the camp, heading for the Sultan's personal quarters. They got close, close enough that Mehmed barely escaped with his life. According to accounts, the Sultan fled his tent in his nightclothes as Wallachian cavalry cut down his guards. But Vlad couldn't maintain the attack. The Ottoman camp was too large, too well defended, once alert. As dawn broke, Vlad's forces had to retreat before they were surrounded and destroyed. They'd caused massive casualties. Estimates range from 5,000 to 15,000 Ottoman dead, and created psychological trauma that would last for days. But they hadn't killed Mehmed. The night attack became legendary. Ottoman sources admit it happened but minimize the damage. Wallachian and European sources portray it as a brilliant tactical success that nearly ended the war in one stroke. The truth is somewhere in between. It didn't kill Mehmed, but it showed that Vlad was willing to take insane risks and that he understood psychological warfare. The Ottoman army was shaken. These weren't supposed to be fighting a deliberate guerrilla war against an outnumbered defender. They were supposed to be crushing a minor principality in a standard military campaign. Instead, they'd been ambushed in their own camp by a force that nearly killed their sultan. But what really broke Ottoman morale came a few days later when the army continued north toward Vlad's capital. When Sultan Mehmed's army approached Targoviste, Vlad's capital city, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. Outside the city, stretching for miles, was a forest of impaled corpses. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands upon thousands. Contemporary estimates range from 20,000 to 30,000 bodies, impaled on stakes arranged in geometric patterns that stretched for nearly 3 kilometers. This wasn't just random execution. This was organized, systematic, almost architectural in its horror. The stakes were arranged in concentric circles and precise rows. Bodies were at different stages of decay. Some were fresh corpses, some had been rotting in the summer heat for weeks, some were just skeletons still pinned to their stakes with bits of dried flesh and cloth hanging from the bones. Most of the victims were Ottoman prisoners of war from Vlad's raids the previous winter. There were also Turkish civilians who'd been captured from Bulgarian towns, Wallachian traitors and criminals. Anyone Vlad had decided to execute over the previous months, all displayed together in this massive necropolis of impaled corpses. The smell must have been overwhelming. Thousands of bodies decomposing in summer heat, with clouds of ravens and crows picking up at the corpses. The visual impact was deliberately designed to be as horrifying as possible. This was the fate awaiting anyone who opposed Vlad the Impaler. The Ottomans called it the Forest of the Impaled. German accounts called it the Field of Blood. Byzantine sources describe it as a sight so horrible that even the Sultan himself was horrified. And here's the thing, Sultan Mehmed II was not a squeamish man. He'd personally ordered executions, conducted brutal sieges, then seen battlefields covered in dead. He'd conquered Constantinople by artillery bombardment that killed thousands. He'd executed political rivals and crushed rebellions with extreme violence. This was not a man with a weak stomach. But according to multiple sources, when Mehmed saw the forest of impaled corpses, he ordered his army to stop. He reportedly said something along the lines of, "What can you do against a man like this?" He realized he was fighting someone who had no limits, who would use any level of violence, who saw human beings as tools and terror as a weapon. The Sultan had brought an army of 90,000 or to 150,000 men to crush this small principality. He'd expected a military campaign that would be over in a few weeks. Instead, he was facing a defender who had turned warfare into psychological horror, who was willing to sacrifice his own territory to scorched earth, and who had just demonstrated that he'd impaled tens of thousands of people as a message. Mehmed turned his army around and went home. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who conquered Constantinople, who built one of the largest empires in history, who had crushed armies and besieged fortified cities around 3 continents, looked at Vlad's forest of impaled corpses and decided, nope, not worth it. But Mehmed wasn't giving up on conquering Wallachia. He just changed tactics. Instead of fighting Vlad directly, he'd put someone else on the throne, someone he knew was loyal to the Ottoman Empire, someone who'd grown up in Ottoman court and converted to Islam. He gave Vlad's brother Radu an Ottoman army and told him to take over Wallachia. This is where Vlad's story gets tragic, because for all his brutality and tactical genius, he couldn't fight everyone at once. Radu invaded with Ottoman backing in mid-1462, shortly after Mehmed's retreat. He brought in a large Ottoman army, significant resources, and, crucially, legitimacy. He was Vlad's brother, he was Wallachian by birth, and he could claim he was liberating Wallachia from a tyrant rather than conquering it for the Ottomans. And a lot of Wallachians believed him, or at least preferred him to Vlad, because here's the uncomfortable truth. While Vlad was defending Wallachia from Ottoman conquest, he was also terrorizing his own population. The boyars who survived his purges hated him. The peasants lived in constant fear of being impaled for minor infractions. The merchants had seen their towns burned in scorched earth campaigns. The clergy was uncomfortable with his extreme violence. When Radu showed up, offering an end to the terror in exchange for becoming an Ottoman vassal state, a lot of people thought, honestly, that sounds better than living under Vlad. The boyars started defecting to Radu. Cities opened their gates. Vlad found himself fighting a civil war while he was still trying to hold off the Ottomans. He retreated to his mountain fortress at Poenari, the one he'd rebuilt using boyar slave labor years earlier. He sent desperate letters to the Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, begging for support. He sent evidence of his battles against the Ottomans. He argued that if Wallachia fell, Hungary would be next. He essentially pleaded for the military alliance that was supposed to exist between Wallachia and Hungary. Matthias's response was to have him arrested. The charges were absurd. Supposedly Vlad had been secretly negotiating with the Ottomans, which made zero sense given that he'd just spent years fighting them and had created a literal forest of Turkish corpses. But Matthias wanted Hungarian resources for other campaigns. He was planning to become King of Bohemia and needed money for that. Funding Vlad's war against the Ottomans was expensive and politically complicated. So Matthias betrayed Vlad, took the money that had been raised for anti-Ottoman campaigns, and used it for his own political ambitions. He arrested Vlad when the Wallachian prince came to Hungary expecting military support, then justified the arrest with fabricated evidence of treason. Vlad spent the next 12 years imprisoned in Hungary, not in a dungeon, more like a house arrest in a castle near Buda. Matthias still thought Vlad might be useful later, so he kept him alive and relatively comfortable. But comfortable imprisonment is still imprisonment, especially for someone like Vlad, who'd spent their entire adult life fighting for power. During these 12 years, Vlad allegedly converted to Catholicism, learned Hungarian, read extensively, and possibly even got married to a Hungarian noblewoman with connections to the royal family. He had 2 sons during this period. By all accounts, he adapted to his new situation and played the long game, waiting for the political situation to shift. Meanwhile, Radu ruled Wallachia as an Ottoman vassal. He kept peace with the Ottomans, paid tribute, and governed relatively peacefully. Everything Vlad had fought for, Wallachian independence, resistance to Ottoman expansion, was undone. His brother, the one who had adapted and embraced Ottoman culture, while Vlad resisted during their hostage years, was now sitting on this throne, doing exactly what the Ottomans wanted. But then in 1473, Radu died of syphilis. The Ottoman-backed government in Wallachia became unstable. A series of weak rulers took power and were quickly overthrown. The Ottomans were dealing with the other military campaigns and couldn't devote full attention to propping up a Wallachian puppet. And suddenly Matthias Corvinus remembered that he had Vlad the Impaler in reserve. In 1475, the political situation shifted again. The Ottomans were pushing deeper into Eastern Europe. Matthias was facing pressure from the Pope and other Christian rulers to actually do something about the Ottoman threat instead of just talking about it. And Wallachia was in chaos with nobody firmly in control. Matthias decided that maybe having Vlad the Impaler fighting the Ottomans again wasn't such a bad idea after all. The man was absolutely ruthless, had proven he could terrify Ottoman armies, and was motivated by genuine hatred of the Ottomans rather than just political calculation. So Vlad was released from captivity, given an army, and sent back to Wallachia. He was in his mid-40s now, had been out of power for 12 years, had a Hungarian wife and children, and was marching back to reclaim a throne he'd lost more than a decade earlier. He arrived in Wallachia in November 1476 with a Hungarian backing. Current ruler Basarab Laiota fled without much of a fight. Vlad took back his throne and immediately started trying to reassert control. He reached out to his old supporters, tried to rebuild his power base, and prepared to resume his war against the Ottomans. But he'd been gone too long. The boyars who'd survived his first reign hadn't forgotten or forgiven. New political factions had formed, and the Ottomans weren't about to let him consolidate power again. In December 1476, less than 2 months after reclaiming his throne, Vlad was killed in battle near Bucharest. The exact circumstances are unclear because different sources give different accounts. Some say he was killed by Ottoman forces in a battle near the forest of Vlasia. Some say it was Wallachian boyars who betrayed him during the battle. Some accounts claim it was an accident in the chaos of fighting. Some say he was deliberately abandoned by his own men who wanted him dead. What's clear is that Vlad Dracula died in combat, probably in a relatively small skirmish rather than a major battle. His head was cut off and sent to Constantinople, where Sultan Mehmed II had it displayed on a stake as proof that the infamous Vlad the Impaler was finally dead. The irony of Vlad being beheaded and displayed on a stake, his own signature method turned against him, was probably not lost on anyone. He was 45 years old. He'd spent his childhood as a hostage, fought his entire adult life for his country's independence, used the most brutal methods imaginable to maintain control, terrified armies and sultans, and in the end, he lost everything anyway. Wallachia continued to be fought over by competing powers. The Ottomans eventually fully conquered it. The independence he'd fought for lasted barely longer than he did. His body was supposedly buried at Snagov Monastery, an island monastery on a lake near Bucharest. But when archaeologists excavated the supposed tomb in the 1930s, they found no body. Either it had been completely decomposed, or he was buried somewhere else, or the whole thing is a myth. Even in death, Vlad remained elusive. So how did this medieval warlord become the most famous vampire in fiction? To understand that, we need to talk about the propaganda war that started even before Vlad died. During his lifetime and immediately after his death, stories about Vlad spread across Europe through printed pamphlets. Printing presses were still relatively new in the 1460s. Gutenberg had invented the movable type printing press around 1440, and by the 1460s, German printers were cranking out pamphlets and books at an unprecedented rate. These German pamphlets about Vlad were basically the medieval equivalent of true crime documentaries. They had lurid titles like The Frightening and Truly Extraordinary Story of a Wicked Blood Drinking Tyrant Called Prince Dracula. They included woodcut illustrations showing Vlad eating dinner surrounded by impaled corpses, having people boiled alive, and committing various other atrocities. Some of these stories were probably based on real events, some were exaggerated, and some were likely fabricated entirely. The pamphlet publishers were running businesses, and horror stories sold well. The more outrageous the tale, the more copies they'd sell. But here's the thing. There were too many sources from too many different places telling similar stories for it all to be fabricated. Ottoman sources, Hungarian sources, German sources, Romanian sources, Russian sources, they all describe Vlad as unusually cruel, even by medieval standards. When your enemies, your allies, and your own people all agree you were a brutal tyrant, that's probably because you were a brutal tyrant. The Russian sources are particularly interesting because they show a more complex view of Vlad. Russian Slavic tales portrayed him as a harsh but effective ruler who brought order to a chaotic land. Yes, he was cruel, but his cruelty served a purpose, eliminating corruption, punishing criminals, and defending Christianity against Ottoman expansion. Some Russian sources essentially portrayed him as a necessary monster, the kind of leader you need when facing existential threats. This more nuanced view also appeared in Romanian folklore and historical accounts. To this day, Vlad occupies a complicated space in Romanian national consciousness. He is not celebrated for the impalement, but he is remembered as a defender of Romanian independence, who stood up to empires that wanted to conquer the region. There is a statue of him in Bucharest. The castle at Bran, which probably has no actual connection to Vlad but is marketed as Dracula's castle, is a major tourist attraction. The Romanian government uses Vlad as a symbol of national resistance. It's the medieval equivalent of, yes, he was a war criminal, but he was our war criminal, which is complicated historically and morally. But the stories that really cemented Vlad's legacy were the German horror pamphlets. These were reprinted for centuries. They became the medieval equivalent of campfire horror stories. Parents would tell their children tales of Vlad the Impaler as cautionary tales. The stories got darker and more elaborate with each retelling. And then in the 1890s, an Irish author doing research for a vampire novel stumbled across these old German pamphlets. Bram Stoker was working on a vampire novel in the early 1890s. He'd been fascinated by vampire folklore from various European cultures and wanted to write something that would capture the gothic horror atmosphere he loved. His original plan was to set the story in Austria and call his vampire Count Vampire. The vampire would be an aristocrat with supernatural powers based on various European vampire legends. It was a solid concept, but nothing particularly original. Then Stoker came across a book called An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson, published in 1820. This book had a footnote mentioning Vlad Dracula, explaining that Dracula meant devil in the Wallachian language, and that Vlad had been a ruler known for extreme cruelty. Stoker found this fascinating and started researching further. He learned about Transylvania, the mountain region between Wallachia and Hungary. He learned about the historical Vlad's reputation for bloodshed and his connection to the Ottoman wars. He learned about the son of the dragon devil naming thing. And he thought, this is perfect. Stoker changed his vampire's name to Count Dracula, moved the setting to Transylvania, and drew on the historical Vlad's reputation for cruelty. The novel he published in 1897 became Dracula, and it changed the vampire fiction forever. But here's what's interesting. Stoker's Count Dracula isn't actually that similar to the historical Vlad. The novel's Dracula is a sophisticated aristocrat with supernatural powers who drinks blood to survive. He's suave, elegant, sexually threatening, and ultimately tragic. He is immortal and supernatural. The real Vlad was a medieval warlord with no supernatural powers who used extreme violence as a political tool. He wasn't elegant or romantic, he was just brutally effective at using terror to maintain power and fight off empires. In fact, if you look at the actual body count and creative cruelty, the real Vlad was way worse than the fictional one. Count Dracula kills a few people in the novel, maybe a dozen directly, plus some implied victims. Vlad killed tens of thousands of people using one of the most brutal execution methods in history. The vampire is a monster, sure, but he is a fantasy monster with supernatural powers and gothic romance. The real Dracula was just a human being who chose to do monstrous things, which is actually way more terrifying when you think about it. Stoker's novel became a phenomenon. It's been in print continuously since 1897. It's been adapted into hundreds of films, TV shows, plays, and other media. Count Dracula became the archetypal vampire. Every modern vampire story traces back to either Stoker's Dracula or the 1922 unauthorized film adaptation Nosferatu. And through all of this, the real Vlad the Impaler became permanently linked with vampire mythology. Tourists visit Romania looking for Dracula's castle. The castle at Bram has no real connection to Vlad. He might have stopped there once or twice, but he never actually lived there. It doesn't matter, it's called Dracula's Castle now, and it's a major tourist attraction. The medieval warlord who terrorized the Balkans in the 1460s had been transformed into an immortal vampire who lives forever in popular culture. It's the ultimate irony. The man who used extreme violence to try to preserve his power and his country's independence is now remembered primarily through a Victorian Gothic novel that has almost nothing to do with the historical reality. So what are we supposed to take away from all of this? That violence works? That terror is an effective governing strategy? That fighting for independence justifies any atrocity? None of those feel right, honestly. I think the real takeaway is that Vlad shows us what happens when someone decides that ends justify means, when every moral boundary becomes negotiable in pursuit of a goal, even a theoretically noble one like defending your homeland. Vlad fought foreign empires, but he also tortured his own people. He executed merchants, nobles, peasants, anyone who crossed him or failed to meet his standards, or just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He didn't just fight external threats, he created internal terror. And in the end, it didn't even work. Wallachia was eventually conquered by the Ottomans anyway. It remained under Ottoman control until the 19th century. The independence Vlad fought for lasted barely longer than his reign. You could argue that his tactics were necessary, that without extreme violence he couldn't have maintained power for such a brutal era, that he was facing impossible odds and did the best that he could. Some historians make this argument, pointing out that medieval warfare was brutal everywhere, and Vlad was just more effective at it than his contemporaries. But even by medieval standards, Vlad stood out. Other rulers used execution and violence, but they didn't systematically impale tens of thousands of people and arrange them in geometric patterns as psychological warfare. Other defenders fought off invasions, but they didn't turn their countries into forests of corpses to make a point. There is a difference between necessary ruthlessness and systematic sadism. Vlad crossed that line so thoroughly that even his contemporaries were horrified. The question historians still argue about is whether Vlad was genuinely sadistic or whether he was using extreme violence as a calculated strategy. Did he enjoy the cruelty, or was it just the most effective tool he had? The answer is probably both. You don't become known as the Impaler across three continents purely through cold strategic calculation. At some point, the willingness to torture thousands of people to death, to eat dinner surrounded by impaled corpses, to have turbans nailed to people's heads because they didn't remove them fast enough, at some point, that suggests something darker than pragmatic ruthlessness. But you also don't hold off the Ottoman Empire with the fractions of their military forces by being squeamish. Vlad's brutality made him terrifying, and that terror was his greatest weapon. The forest of the impaled actually worked. It turned back an Ottoman army that outnumbered Vlad's forces 5-1. So we're left with this uncomfortable reality. Vlad's extreme violence was both effective in the short term and ultimately pointless in the long term. It won him individual battles while losing him the war. It defended Wallachia temporarily while ensuring it would eventually be conquered. It made him feared across continents while making it impossible for him to build lasting alliances or domestic support. Today, Vlad the Impaler exists in two completely different forms in popular consciousness. In Western popular culture, he is Dracula, the vampire, the gothic monster, the dark aristocrat with supernatural powers. He is sexy, tragic, immortal. He's been played by countless actors from Bela Lugosi to Christopher Lee to Gary Oldman. He'd been reimagined as everything from a misunderstood romantic hero to a campy Halloween costume. The vampire Dracula is everywhere in modern culture, from True Blood to Twilight to What We Do in the Shadows. In Romania and Eastern Europe, he is Vlad Tepes, the historical figure, the defender of Wallachia, the prince who stood up to empires. He is complicated, controversial, but ultimately is a symbol of national resistance. You can buy Vlad the Impaler wine in Romanian supermarkets. There are statues of him in public squares. The Romanian government has used his image in tourism campaigns. Neither of these images is really accurate to who the historical Vlad actually was. The vampire Dracula is pure fiction, created by Bram Stoker from a mix of European folklore, Victorian Gothic aesthetics, and a few historical details about a medieval prince. He is entertainment, mythology, cultural shorthand for a certain type of monster. The Romanian national hero version is closer to reality, but still sanitized. Yes, Vlad fought for Wallachian independence. Yes, he resisted Ottoman conquest. But the full story of the systematic torture campaigns and his brutality toward his own people gets minimized or justified in ways that are historically questionable. The real Vlad was a traumatized hostage who became a ruthless warlord, using the most brutal methods available to try to maintain power in an impossible political situation. He was effective in some ways and catastrophically counterproductive in others. He was both a defender of his homeland and a terrorizer of his own people. He was both tactically brilliant and ultimately defeated. The fictional vampire drinks blood to survive and lives forever. The real Dracula drowned his country in blood and died violently at 45, beheaded and displayed on a stake, his own signature method turned against him in a final brutal irony. His body disappeared from its supposed tomb. His head was displayed in Constantinople and then lost to history. His legacy became a horror story that's been retold, adapted, and reimagined thousands of times across 500 years. History decided which one was the real monster. But honestly, when you look at the full story, the answer is pretty clear. The vampire is fictional. The atrocities were real. So blow out your candles, get comfortable, and sleep well, knowing that the real Dracula had been dead for over 500 years. The fictional one, though, he is immortal. Sweet dreams.